What's going on, everybody? Kalibus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, we're going to be doing a quick comparison between the Cricket Innovate E5G and the Cricket Dream 5G. Now, the Cricket Dream 5G has been out for quite a while now, and it's definitely one of the more affordable options considering the performance and features it has. On the other hand, the Cricket Innovate E5G did come out a little bit more recently, so in this video, we're going to be going over the differences between the two to help you decide which one is going to be a better choice for you. Now, before we go any further, as always, I do want to remind you to hit that subscribe button, and if you want to learn more about either of these phones individually, I will be linking to several other videos about them in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. So with the Cricket Innovate E5G, we're getting a 6.6-inch LCD display with a resolution of 720p, a PPI of 269, and an aspect ratio of 20:9. With the Cricket Dream 5G, we're getting a 6.82-inch LCD display with a resolution of 720p, a PPI of 263, and an aspect ratio of 20.5:9. So in general, these phones have pretty decent displays for what they are, and in a lot of ways they're essentially going to be the same. The only real difference here is that with the Cricket Dream 5G at 6.82 inches versus 6.6, this phone is clearly larger, and this tends to be a good thing when you're consuming a lot of content. And in addition to this, with an aspect ratio of 20.5:9 versus 20:9, the Cricket Dream 5G has a taller and more narrow form factor. So if you're doing something like watching a video in landscape mode, for example, you're going to get a more immersive experience. And if you're doing something vertical like browsing the web or using social media, you'll be able to fit more content on the screen without having to scroll as much. So in general, while the Innovate E5G is really not bad for what it is, because of the size and dimensions, I would say the Cricket Dream 5G will be a better choice if you're consuming a lot of content. Now for storage, both phones have 64GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, so for more entry-level phones, this definitely is not bad. For the average user, it's at least going to be acceptable here, so as long as you're mindful of what you're putting on your phone, either phone will have a decent amount of storage. But that being said, if you're more of a power user, if you have a lot of apps and stuff like that, then I would recommend going for a higher end device with more storage, because while again 64GB is at least acceptable, in this day and age, with stuff like apps, the system, and just files in general getting larger and larger, if you are more of a heavy user and you're putting a lot of stuff on your phone, 64GB is going to fill up pretty quickly. But that being said, again, for what they are, if you are more of a casual user and you're not really putting a ton of things on your phone, then as far as storage goes, either of these phones will be perfectly fine. And again, remember, they both do have microSD card expansion, and this is great for offloading stuff like photos and videos. Now for security features, the Cricket Innovate E5G does have Face Unlock, whereas the Cricket Dream 5G doesn't. So if you do like to use Face Unlock, definitely keep this in mind. In addition to this, both phones do have fingerprint scanners right here in the back, so definitely not a bad spot for them. But starting with the Cricket Innovate E5G, let's go ahead and give them a try. There we go, one more time. And there we go. And now for the Dream 5G. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see, both fingerprint scanners were real fast and responsive. They were pretty much the same. And again, remember, with the Cricket Innovate E5G, you are going to get Face Unlock, whereas you're not with the Cricket Dream 5G. So if that is a feature you want to use, the Cricket Innovate E5G will have a bit of an advantage. Now taking a look at the camera setups here, with the Cricket Innovate E5G, we got a water drop notch for the front facing camera. This camera is 5 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a dual camera setup with a 13 megapixel main camera and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. So not the most feature packed camera out there, but for more regular photos, it will get the job done. With the Cricket Dream 5G, we got pretty much the same design for the front facing camera. This camera is 13 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a quad camera setup with a 48 megapixel main camera, an 8 megapixel ultra wide camera, a 2 megapixel macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. So in general, as far as features go, as you can clearly see, the Cricket Dream 5G will have a huge advantage since it does have pretty much every feature you find in a mid-range phone, despite being more of an entry-level phone. So if you are taking a lot of photos and you want features like an ultra wide camera and a macro camera, then the Cricket Dream 5G will be a significantly better choice. In addition to this, as far as quality goes, neither of these phones is going to be exceptionally good. Remember, again, these really are entry-level phones, so you can only expect so much. But that being said, in my experience, the Cricket Dream 5G does take significantly better photos, so if you are taking a lot of pictures, maybe to share on social media for example, then while in my opinion, even in this price range, there are a lot of better options out there, between the two, the Cricket Dream 5G will be a better choice. But that being said, with the Cricket Innovate E5G, this phone doesn't really take terrible photos, and if you're just taking the occasional photo here and there, then this phone will at least get the job done. Now as far as RAM and processor go, these phones are pretty much identical, both of them getting 4GB of RAM with the MediaTek Dimensity 700 processor, so that's definitely definitely interesting here. On one hand, from my experience, pretty much every phone I've used that has that processor has great performance, but on the other hand, in general, as you can probably tell at this point in the video, the Cricket Innovate E5G is really similar to the Cricket Dream 5G, except it doesn't have quite as many features, so I'm not really sure why Cricket would make a newer phone that has less features but pretty much the same processor as an older phone. But regardless, as far as just performance in general goes, you can expect both of these phones to be really fast for what they are. If you're doing basic activities like web browsing, social media, streaming videos and music, and even light mobile gaming, these phones will be able to handle that kind of activity perfectly fine. But that being said, keep in mind, neither of these phones are anywhere near as fast as a flagship phone, for example. So if you're doing higher performance activities like more intense mobile gaming, or you're just going to be on your phone all the time, in that case, well, again, these phones are not slow by any means. If you are going to be using your phone heavily, I would still recommend going for a higher end device with a faster processor. But that being said, in general, based on my experience with these phones, I feel like either of them will be plenty fast enough for the average user. Now that being said, I did run Geekbench 5 benchmark tests on both of them, and here are the scores right here. As expected, they're pretty much exactly the same, which is probably not surprising, since after all, they have the exact same RAM and processor. So that being said, no matter which of these phones you get, you're not really going to see a significant performance difference between the two. But that being said, what I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone and comparing your results to these, and that'll give you a better idea of whether or not these phones will be an upgrade for you, because depending on what you're coming from, this level of performance may or may not be. Now for the batteries, the Cricket Innovate E5G has a 4000 mAh battery, and with the Cricket Dream 5G, we're getting a 4750 mAh battery. So there is a bit of a difference here. On one hand, the Cricket Innovate E5G doesn't have a terrible battery, and as long as you're not using it really heavily, it should at least get you through the day. But with the Cricket Dream 5G, although it's not quite a 5000 mAh battery, at 4750 mAh, this phone definitely does have a decently large battery, so if battery life is important to you, then of course the Cricket Dream 5G will have a significant advantage. Now another thing to keep in mind here is the Cricket Dream 5G does have wireless charging, making it one of the most affordable phones that has this feature, whereas with the Cricket Innovate E5G, unfortunately this phone does not get wireless charging, so if you do like that feature, definitely keep this in mind as well. Now as far as the software goes, the Cricket Innovate E5G does have Android 12, whereas the Cricket Dream 5G only has Android 11. Now on one hand, obviously neither of these phones has the latest version of Android, but on the other hand, if you actually care about the software and you want the newest one between the two, the Cricket Innovate E5G of course will have an advantage. But on the other hand, if you don't really care about having the newest version of Android, which in this price range probably not everyone does, the Cricket Dream 5G will be perfectly fine, and in my experience, despite only having Android 11, the phone does run pretty well. In addition to this, both phones do have NFC, so if you like to make contactless mobile payments using Tap and Pay, you'll be happy to know that you can do that with either of these. But in conclusion, which of these phones is better? In general, I feel like in pretty much every way, the Cricket Dream 5G is the better device. Honestly, when I first heard about the Cricket Innovate E5G, I thought this was basically going to be a new and improved version of the Cricket Dream 5G, but unfortunately it's pretty much the complete opposite. On one hand, it is a newer phone with a newer software, but on the other hand, as far as features and honestly even just quality goes, it's basically just a more stripped down version of the Cricket Dream 5G, and as of the recording of this video, they're pretty much the same price. So in general, in pretty much any situation, I would personally say that Cricket Dream 5G is going to be a better choice here. It has a significantly larger display with better dimensions, and that tall and narrow form factor is definitely going to give you a great experience when you're consuming a lot of content. It also has wireless charging, which again is not a feature you're going to find every day, especially in a phone like this. It has a significantly better camera setup that not only takes better photos, but also has a lot more features like an ultra-wide camera and a macro camera, whereas again, the Cricket Innovate E5G really only has a normal camera and I guess portrait mode. But other than that, pretty much nothing else, and the photo quality with this phone again is not nearly as good as the Cricket Dream 5G. And of course, the Cricket Dream 5G also has a larger battery as well, so when it comes to battery life, this is definitely another thing to keep in mind. Really the only time I would choose the Cricket Innovate E5G over the Cricket Dream 5G is either if you could get this phone for free and the Cricket Dream 5G was going for full price, or if you just want a newer version of Android, because keep in mind, since these are really just Cricket phones, I would definitely not expect any major updates on them. But in pretty much every other situation, I definitely think that despite the Cricket Innovate E5G being a newer phone, the Cricket Dream 5G is still a much better device. But this concludes my comparison between the Cricket Innovate E5G and the Cricket Dream 5G. Again, if you want to learn more about either of these phones individually, I will be linking to several other videos about them in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Khalipa's Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.